Hello, my name is David Atkinson and I am Managing Director of 4 Pillars Consulting, and in this video today I'm going to walk you through what we know as the portfolio matrix. It is a tool used by professional procurement organizations the world over since it was first published in 1983 by an academic called Peter Kralich. So let me talk you through firstly about what the purpose is of this matrix in its use by procurement professionals. So let's just label it portfolio matrix, or portfolio analysis as some people refer to it. The purpose of it is threefold. Number one, it's a segmentation tool that procurement leaders use to work out which are the most important categories to spend time on. So it's segmentation. So everything that an organization buys, from office supplies right through to the most important services from maybe strategic consultants and so on, has to go through the segmentation process, which then helps the Chief Procurement Officer to prioritize. So this matrix tells the leader, the procurement leader, the Chief Procurement Officer, which are the most important categories that really must be effectively managed and those that are less important, maybe the one-off expenditure. But the third purpose of this matrix is very useful for leaders in that it helps them allocate their resources to the most important categories. So in effect, things that are really important will get the attention of the Chief Procurement Officer or other senior people within the team, but the less important ones will be managed by maybe junior buyers or graduates coming out of university, learning how to do the procurement job. So, purpose, segmentation. The second one is to prioritize, understand which are the most important and those that are less important, and thirdly, about allocating resources. So let me go on to talk about how the matrix actually works. So the first thing, it has two axes. The first thing we're going to concern ourselves with, or if you were the procurement leader, this is what you would be concerned with, is how much money am I spending across all of my portfolio? So if I'm a Chief Procurement Officer responsible for $1 billion of spend, what I will do, and this is high, low, I'll come back to the vertical axis in a moment. I work out of my $1 billion, which are the categories of spend that we spend the most money on, which are the most important ones from a financial perspective. And so this is spend, and sometimes we think about the value impact as well, but spend is usually the most important, or the one that's most effectively used. So just to be clear, high spend items over on the right-hand side, low spend items over here. The vertical axis is what we call market difficulty. So market difficulty, from low to high. Now you imagine if you are a head of procurement or a Chief Procurement Officer in an organization, or you're dealing with one as one of your customers, he or she will be thinking about, is this market easy to deal with, or is it very, very challenging? Now, an easy market in which to source from is one where there are many competitors. You're basically buying a generic series of products or services that many suppliers can meet your needs. And you would place these somewhere down the lower side of this axis. At the top end, this is where we're buying categories of spend that are much more difficult to buy. There are fewer suppliers can meet our needs. We might even have unique requirements that nobody else is buying. So this is where the supply market becomes difficult, because there's often only one or two suppliers that can meet our needs. And in extreme circumstances, we might be buying from a monopoly supplier. So we're concerned here about how much money are we spending relative to the total portfolio, and how difficult or easy is the supply market. And there are 4 generic strategies that procurement leaders and procurement teams will, this model will help them determine. The first one in the bottom left-hand box, here where we've got relatively low spend and relatively easy supply market, these are what procurement professionals call transactional categories. Transactional. It means essentially that these are run-of-the-mill purchases of which the procurement task is relatively easy. And the priority for procurement in this box is to really simplify, standardize, and automate. If you are the leader of procurement in an organization and you're looking at the total portfolio, items that are in the transactional box, you don't want to be spending so much time on them. Because even if you did a fantastic job of delivering lots of savings from these categories, the overall spend impact, the savings impact across the whole portfolio will still be relatively small. If we move to the right-hand side and still think about a supply market that's relatively easy, but this time you're spending a lot of money, this is what procurement professionals call the leverage box. And the leverage box, the label itself kind of describes the procurement job. It's about really driving, using the company's power, its negotiating leverage, to try and get the best possible deals. So here it'll be critically important to make sure that you get cost savings. And maybe in another video, at some point we'll talk about what the supplier response will be. But if you are a supplier, imagine for a moment, if you are a supplier to a customer that places your category of spend in the leverage box, if you're not delivering cost savings in the particular financial year, somebody else will. One of your competitors will be doing that. So this is where you're really driving cost savings and driving value for money very assertively. The third box, which is the top left-hand box, we call the critical box. You'll sometimes describe it in the original model as the bottleneck quadrant. This is where you're not spending a lot of money, relatively speaking. So these are not the most important items for you commercially, but you need those services or products within your own offering. So they are important to some significant degree, but the market is difficult. Maybe 1 or 2 suppliers, as I mentioned earlier, will be supplying this area. So your job as a procurement person in this box is to manage risk. And by risk, I'm talking about operational risk. The failure of a supplier to supply could stop the production line or stop a service being delivered to an external client or customer. But there's also commercial risk. And that one of the characteristics of categories that are in this box is that suppliers are smart enough to know that they are providing something that is unique and special to the customer. And so what tends to happen is they make sure they get extraordinary returns from that. So they raise prices. It's much more difficult for the procurement person to say to a supplier supplying a category in the critical box, it's much more difficult for them to say, if you don't give us a cost saving, we're going to take the business elsewhere, because that option is not always available. So managing risk. And the fourth quadrant is the strategic quadrant, where most suppliers like to be. And this is really about managing the relationship. What we're dealing with here, if from the procurement perspective, is something that a category of spend or categories of spend that's very important. We spend a lot of money on it. It's one of the most important things exercising the agenda of the Chief Procurement Officer. But it's also very difficult, because this is the realm where you might find partnerships or strategic alliances beginning to emerge. So you manage the relationship here, and you're trying your very best from a procurement perspective to get the best possible value. The best possible value for money. Now, it's fair to say this is a prescription for how procurement does its strategy development for each of the categories of spend, but none of these are completely exclusive. The thing about this matrix that's particularly useful for procurement leaders is that it allows them to have some choices. And so, for example, even though here you might have, if you were a supplier supplying a category in the customer's leverage box where the pressure for cost down is enormous, procurement still has the choice to offer a long-term contract if it thinks it's that's going to provide them with the best long-term result. But equally, you could find a situation where you're having to rebid for the work every 6 or 12 months. So it gives procurement choices, but you can see that there are 4 distinctive strategy prescriptions within each of these 4 quadrants. Now, I'd like to say a little bit about what type of procurement person you will see managing categories in each of these 4 boxes. So if you are dealing, for example, if you are supplying a category to a customer where you've been through your analysis and the use of this matrix, you've determined that your category sits in the critical box from the customer's perspective. What you'll find there is often you've got buyers or category managers, as they're sometimes called, who have been around the business for quite a long time. They may have been recruited into procurement from a user department or a technical department. They usually have good technical expertise. They will perhaps understand the specification extraordinarily well. And so if you are a technical salesperson or a technical support person within a supplying organization, you'll find that you can have a real value-based discussion, a real good discussion around the technicalities of the product or the service if it's sitting in this box. If, however, you're supplying a product or service that the customer places in the transactional box, this is where we often find the junior buyers or the junior category managers. Men or women who have come out of university, maybe young graduates, learning how to do procurement on relatively low risk categories from the customer's perspective. Obviously, I think, I say obviously because it's not always so obvious, is that a lot of suppliers and particularly account managers think it's really advantageous to build up a strong relationship with the Chief Procurement Officer. Because if we deal with people who have significant influence, we believe that we can build some dependency and some loyalty within the relationship and be able to influence who ultimately gets the business or retains the business when it comes up for tender. The access to the CPO is almost exclusively in categories that are in the strategic box. So the spend is big, the market is difficult. This is where the procurement itself will be thinking about how do we build the right sort of relationships with the right suppliers to maintain a degree of harmony within the relationship so that that operational and commercial risk is well managed. So good access to the CPO or really senior people here. In the leverage box, finally, this is where we see the experienced Rottweilers or attack dogs. These people who have probably joined the business at some time in the past or come from somewhere else, have earned their basic skills, developed their basic skills in transactional categories, but have moved into leverage. And so the importance to the customer or a procurement organization to get savings here is fundamental to the procurement job. Because if it's not successful in delivering savings from leverage categories, it's probably not going to be hitting its targets and is not going to be successful within the customer's business. So here you'd experience, if you were a supplier as account manager, you'd experience a lot of assertive, maybe sometimes aggressive behavior and threats to move the business. So junior buyers, technical buyers, senior buyers, including the Chief Procurement Officer, and then also more experienced people here who are very aggressive. So I hope you found this useful. Please get in touch if you need any more information. The details will be at the end of this video. And thanks for listening. Bye-bye.